Hey guys, welcome back to the From Mourning to Meaning interview series, where we are learning how to break through the intolerable grief and return to meaningful living. I'm Laura Isabel, and today I have with me Mandy Capehart. Mandy, thank you so much for joining us.
Hi, Laura Isabel. Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
Of course. Now, for those of you that don't know Mandy, she's an author, certified grief and life coach, and founder of the Restorative Grief Project. She co-hosts the Uncomfortable Grace podcast, as well as leads Women's Fight Night. Why don't you tell us a little bit of all of that?
All of my projects. Okay, yeah. So I am an author. My new book, Restorative Grief, Embracing Our Losses Without Losing Ourselves, actually comes out tomorrow. And I'm very excited. So for whenever you see this, that's June 12th, which you can go and buy it on Amazon. I became a grief coach about a year ago because I wanted to help people find movement in their losses. I'm very, very interested and constantly pursuing story through people's lives, whether it's through leading Women's Fight Night, which is a platform for women to tell their stories of their faith and how God has intervened in their life and kind of changed where they're headed. And then the Restorative Grief Project came from the coaching. I wanted to allow people an opportunity to share their story of grief, to explore what it might mean for them to have some grace in their own process. And it was actually a very easy carryover because the Uncomfortable Grace podcast is the exact same thing. We ask people who are living out unusual or difficult or tough storylines to share what grace means to them and how they find movement in those sticky places where things feel like a rock in a hard place and a boulder on top and, chains to the side. How do they encounter grace in their day-to-day story? So all of my projects kind of convolute around finding movement, telling your story, and learning who you are so that you can open up the future that you're looking for.
Yeah, so everything kind of goes around, like you just said, telling your story and finding who you are. So how did your story lead you to this? What is your story that got you to all of this?
It's a really good question. My first heart for telling stories and writing was actually my mom. She was a journalist for a short period of time in college, around college age. And it was something that always meant a lot to me because she would pull out these little stories that she had written. I say little stories, but she would pull out pieces she had written and then would talk to me about, oh, remember the book I was writing too. She was illustrating and drawing a book when my sister and I were little about a little character named Sam the Clam. And it was very sweet. So fast forward, she didn't do much with those after she got into another industry, but I loved it because it reminded me the importance of pursuing what is important to you. And so I have worked so many different jobs. I went to school for anthropology and journalism and photography, but I ended up working in coffee, in retail, in hospitality, in finance, all of these things around service industry, but never what I really wanted to be doing. And so what I recognized in the last 5 or 6 years was, and that's the time frame that I lost my mom as well, who passed away about 5 years ago. I realized life is too short to just keep doing things that I'm good at just because I'm good at them. So it takes a lot of courage to decide, well, this industry is not my right fit. None of this is the right next step for me. So when the pandemic started and quarantine came down in the US, I was laid off. I did recognize that the industry I was in was not the best fit for me. So I thought, well, this is fine. I'll just wait it out like all the rest of us and see what changes, right? This will be just a few weeks. And so in the waiting and in the wondering what's next, I very distinctly remember just feeling so heavy-hearted over watching this global grief, right? This unacknowledged loss that our entire planet was now experiencing, and feeling so burdened because I know that feeling for myself in my own story, but I also know how few people understand the ability to articulate your story and what kind of an authority it gives you by leaning into uncomfortable places. So we had the podcast in our back pocket already. We've been working on it for a while when this conversation started and when that thought process kind of started in my head. And So I decided, let's put my writing skills to good use. I'd been writing just casually for a long time and leading Women's Fight Night for quite a few years at this point. And I decided there's a convalescing of all my heart in all of these things to pursue story, to pursue individuals and remind them who they are and what they've gone through, and teach them how to hold space for themselves instead of waiting for other people to hold space for them. So learning how to advocate for what they need, whether that's through life coaching, which is so similar to grief coaching because life and grief are two sides of the same coin, right? Experience them all. So I think the being able to find movement in my own life and teach others and starting to see them asking themselves some hard questions and wrestling with the fact that I might not get a concrete answer here. I have to be okay with that, and kind of allowing that space for people to wrestle and to fall apart and to ask hard, uncomfortable questions. It's something that it brings me to life, hearing those big questions asked, hearing people say, I encountered this huge trigger in my life and I didn't fall apart, I didn't melt down, or I did melt down and then I was okay. You know, whatever the response is, it's just been the joy of my life as I'm realizing, oh, this is what I went to school for. This is why I've always been really curious and love getting to know people, because I want their story. I want them to understand the value of their story. So that's kind of my story as well. I'm a storyteller and a long talker.
No, that's perfect. That's perfect. Awesome. So I know you said at one point you had to lean into what was uncomfortable in those situations that you lost your job and all that stuff, right?
Mm-hmm.
So let me ask you, when your mom passed, did you lean into that grief, or were you more kind of like holding back, not wanting to feel it out?
Good question. It was a combination of both. I live in Southern Oregon, and my mom was in a hospice facility after chemotherapy treatments up in Longview, Washington. So it's an airplane ride and about an hour drive from here. And the day she passed, I flew in and I was late. I was about 30 minutes too late to say goodbye. And my whole family was there, my aunt, my uncle, and my other aunt, my uncle. So we were there, and I immediately went into practical stoicism, like this, just turn off the emotions. Let's just get through what we need to get through. My mom's sister, my aunt, and I are both very direct and very task-oriented people. And the two of us recognized pretty quickly, okay, everybody here needs to eat. What are the next steps we need to do to keep everyone not falling to pieces? So for the duration of that week that I was up at their house, I mean, let me backtrack. Before I even left town, knowing my mom is dying, I called a couple of friends and said, I'm going to be out of town for the next week. I need you to take care of my family. That is what you can do for me practically. You can make sure they have food, make sure they have meals, whatever that is, right? Because taking that off my plate was huge. So I then proceeded to do the same thing for our family. We took care of all the arrangements and started ensuring that we wouldn't feel anything too deeply in that week, because none of us live in the area where she passed. None of us. My sister lives near enough, but we both knew this was not something she could handle or carry on her own. So we worked very hard to get everything done before we left town. And that week was awful. It was a very dry, emotionless. I talk about it in the book. I would hide myself behind books. I would hold things in front of my face to be able to cry behind. Not that I was reading them, but that I was just, I need to let something out, but I can't let too much, because if I do, I won't recover enough to be practical or useful here. So on the flight home, I had this rumbling moment with the Lord where I just said, okay, God, it's either me and you or I'm done. I either have to be all in with you in my grief process, or I'm walking away from my faith. And at the time, I didn't realize how many toxic belief systems I had grabbed and attached to my mom's loss. And in retrospect now, I see who I was and I see what I was carrying, and I have so much compassion for me at that time, because I was just believing things that were not true. They were only true insofar as my life was easy, and so of course they made sense. I've never had to wrestle with that loss or that topic. so after a week, I legitimately said, okay, I'm going to do my best to lean into this grief because I see my family. I know who I am to them. I am someone that is strong and influential, and my family is full of incredibly strong humans, but I don't want to be part of a family that just never addresses it. And we've experienced a lot of loss prior. My grandfather, I mean, we've experienced a lot of loss, but we've never fully talked about it. And I didn't want this to be another one of the situations where families become so detached or just uncomfortable or not sure what to say, or lost at the holidays. You know, he died right after Christmas, and we were all together prior to that holiday. And the following Christmas from that, we all drank ourselves into hangovers the next morning because we didn't know what to do, and I was mixing really strong drinks. So it was awful. The next morning, I'm like, why do we all feel sick? And my uncle's like, because you were pouring triples for everyone all night. And I was like, yeah, that was a mistake on a lot of reasons, on a lot of fronts. And so I've leaned into those uncomfortable moments because poorly a lot of the time. It's that recognizing it on the other side and realizing, okay, that happened. I can't beat myself up. I'm not going to sit here and accuse the family of being a bunch of alcoholics or even struggling, because I'm struggling too. What can I bring to the table that offers grace and movement for all of us? How can I apologize? It was my enabling of all of us that leaned us into that. And I don't say that lightly I don't mean to say like, oh, we're alcoholics because we had one night of binging, or that we struggle. I don't mean to minimize struggling with alcohol at all anyway. But that has been something that I've recognized in my own habits of, oh, I'm coping with this tool. This mechanism is no longer serving. It's become a huge scratch or an impairment to my ability to move forward. So yeah, I mean, having the ability to observe myself on the other side of those moments where I've stumbled, or moments where I've just been like, wow, I've been coming home from work every day and mixing a drink for 2 months straight, and I'm not even drinking them. I'm on muscle memory and then pouring them out. This is a problem. So I think when we get to a place where we can be honest about how uncomfortable we are within grief, we can actually start to see, okay, well, that's fine that that's uncomfortable and I can't touch all of these spots at once, but this one specifically could use some attention, and just, you know, working on that a little bit first and then going the other way. But I've definitely chosen and have to choose repeatedly to lean into it, because it's extremely easy, especially now with all my head knowledge, to just stand back and observe it and think about grief and then say, okay, great, I've thought about it now, instead of feeling it or processing it.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think it's not just you. I think it's a lot of people out there. A lot of people, it's so much harder actually feeling it. So the first instinct is to kind of push away from it or do anything else to keep you busy, whatever that may be, kind of just to hide behind something else, right? And I think that's the normal, not the normal, the natural instinct, like the first thing that you want to do. You don't want to feel the pain. You don't want to suffer. So we kind of push it away, right?
Right.
Yeah, definitely. Were you gonna say something? Go for it.
I was going to say, I think what happens is you have that natural instinct that you mentioned, is that inner desire to be certain. I think as a culture, especially Western culture, where I'm a part of, we have an addiction to security and to certainty. And when we recognize that we do not have security, that we are not handling a certain, you know, our future is uncertain and there's no safety, that we can necessarily, like, that things are unstable or we can't control it, is a good way to put it. It starts to just tumble the foundations. And I know in my experience, what I've been wrestling with in my own life and in my own work is recognizing that in other people and giving them extra grace, and ensuring that, hey, it's okay that you don't have the answers. Beyond it's okay that you're not okay. It's okay that you're scared as hell and trying to preserve whatever you can in your life. What are you going to do with it? Do you want to remain? Do you want, and that's where the coaching side of it comes in, right? I'm not a counselor. I haven't got a master's degree in any of that. So I'm very clear with clients and with friends too. You're talking to me as a friend, or are you talking to me as a coach? Because as a coach, I want you to make some decisions and recognize, do you want to move in a different direction, or are you okay remaining here for a while? And no answer is wrong. They're all perfectly fine, because your story is incredibly unique and super specific to you.
Yeah, definitely. And everyone's grieving is different, right? Every process is different. And it's okay. Some people might want to stay in one a little bit longer than the other. It might not help them advance, but it'll help them feel it out at that moment. And that's probably exactly what they need at that moment. So we can't really say what they should do, right?
Yeah, I am very clear with people. And when I am helping them figure out what am I supposed to say to someone who's grieving, or what should I be saying to myself? I'm like, well, first of all, don't should on yourself. There's no shoulding involved. You can never manipulate yourself into healing. You cannot manipulate or trick yourself into wholeness. And if you start shoulding all over what you should be doing, I should be giving away the clothing, I should be looking for a new job, whatever that is, I'm very, very clear with people saying, actually, there's nothing for you to do. Who should you be right now? Let's make a to-be list instead of a to-do list. And if for you, what you need to be is someone who is busy, how can you cultivate activity that is not harmful or detrimental, or just filling the time to avoid feeling the feelings? What can you become? Who are you becoming? And how can you honor your process of becoming through actually looking at your loss and treating it with respect and with honor, rather than minimizing it or just dismissing it away to the. And there are times when dismissing your grief works, right? We have to compartmentalize sometimes, but I'm also the person that says, well, do you have to compartmentalize at work? Can you take a sabbatical? Yeah, it would be inconvenient for everyone, but grief is inconvenient. It doesn't wait until you have, 3 days planned where you have nothing on the calendar. It's going to disrupt life, because whether you are dealing with, the loss of a pet, the loss of a relationship, an expectation that wasn't met, a death, whatever that is, like, that is inconvenient and it's going to mess with your plan. So I'm a big proponent of figure out who you need to be, what do you need to feel, and how do you have an opportunity to cultivate that psychological safety, that place where you can actually trust yourself and who you're with to recover and to feel as wild as you need to. I'm a big fan of that.
I love it. I love how you hold space for them, but you don't really give them how they should be acting, or it's not kind of like, this is wrong or this is bad for you. It's more of, is this what you need?
Right.
More than anything else.
Yeah. I think we're very accustomed to moralizing grief, saying like, oh, that's the wrong way to grieve. Like, it's really easy to look at my story of getting completely drunk on Christmas Eve with my family and then being able to like, wow, that was really bad. Was it a positive for me? No. Probably shouldn't have done it. However, that language, right? That shouldn't have, and this is bad, that all cultivates shame. And shame is not a healthy motivator. It's a motivator that moves us in a direction, but typically breaks connection and breaks relationship as well. And if I'm trying to restore myself and restore my relationship to who I am and what I believe about the world around me, then I can't should on myself. I can't use shame as the catalyst to growth. It has to be coming from a place of compassion for myself and non-judgmental observation of who I am. Like, yeah, that was a negative behavior. That was a harmful behavior because it didn't feed anything that brought you to life. It fed something that literally changed the color from your skin and gave you a headache for 2 days later, right? It's not a morality thing. It's a, how did that serve you? And is that what you're after? And there's, of course, that's where I just say, coaching is a tool in the toolbox. It's not the end all. It's a piece of the puzzle when you're looking for wholeness. So anytime a client relates to that story, I ask that question, like, okay, well, what are you doing about that? Is that something that you want in your life, or is there something you want different? And it's different, and how can you get that? What tools can you use? So
that's awesome. And I see that you hold an importance for navigating through the grief openly, but not really much putting your belief into it or your beliefs on it. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
So what what would you suggest for doing this? Like, how can people go about doing this? What are some ways that they can do this?
Go through their grief without intermingling it with their faith?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a hard question. Well, I will start by saying the book that I wrote is a 31-day guidebook about part memoir and part guidebook. So I wrote it from my perspective, where I carry faith and how I disentangled, is what I'm calling it, my faith from my understanding of loss. Because I was raised in the Lutheran church, but as a young adult found evangelicalism, which for me has never quite fit right, but no system is perfect and no theology is perfect. So with that thought in the back of my brain, when I approach anything, I looked at grief in the same way, and I thought, well, I know Jesus to be the man of sorrows, and I know what I carry to be true in my heart, but I have heard so much broken theology around grief when it comes to Christianity and specifically evangelicalism. So I wrote this book with the idea of there's wisdom to be found in all things. I'm also someone that believes there's no such thing as secular, like everything is sacred. So for me, it was very easy to say, well, here's my grief and here's my heart for faith. And I know that life and grief are the same coin on two sides. So they have to coincide, they have to intermingle. What does this look like for me? So I wrote the book in a way that you can read it and you can hear my story, but you can easily pull out and replace the word God with anything that resonates with you, not because I think it's easy to dismiss my faith. I'm anyway, but because I think it's very important for people to recognize I am a mature adult, not me specifically, but that they are mature adults who can chew the meat and spit out the bones, so to speak. Find a way to read a book or listen to a podcast or anything like that and discern what serves them and dismiss the rest without giving up everything in between. It's kind of I guess it's kind of like baby in bathwater, right? You don't just say, this is all dirty, I have to get rid of it. You have to actually apply some discernment and some wisdom and recognize that there might be some beliefs that you've held on to that are not in alignment with your values, that are not in alignment with who you are or what is true. And I think grief is the great equalizer when it comes to wrestling in our faith, right? I know people who have completely walked away from their faith because of loss. I know people who have found faith because of loss. It goes both directions. And what I think it comes down to the most is at the core of who you are, where do you feel the greatest sense of peace? I have a friend who works in the grief world that is now an atheist, but was not previously. And a lot of that wrestling was through watching how he interacted with people and how they were responding to faith and how he was struggling to connect with people in that space because of his own wounds, because of his own confusion or whatever it is. And grief is confusing enough. Faith can be confusing enough. And the marriage of the two it doesn't align with what I know about the character of God, right? So if it is outside of peace and outside of if what grief is caused, we know that grief causes us to move outside of our peace. But what I'm trying to say is, if I'm looking at grief and I'm believing something about faith that says these two don't work, if I believe this about grief, then I'm going to hell, or whatever it is, whatever the theology is, it really causes me to stumble. So this is a very long way of saying, I think you have to be able to be willing to hold your grief and your faith very open-handedly, not to where you will just toss them behind you and be done, but to live in a way that you recognize, wow, things are changing. I've been addicted to certainty and safety and security for a very long time. And I didn't think anything would ever change. I never expected them to die. I never expected that relationship to end. Maybe I misunderstand something about grief, and maybe I misunderstand something about faith. And the truth is, we all misunderstand something about faith and grief. None of us has the corner on it. So when you recognize that and can accept and come to a place where you are willing to be curious about your process and curious about what you're learning and what you hold to be true, I think that's where you find movement. I think there's nothing but maturity in that process, in that willingness to wrestle and ask questions and be open to changing your mind.
So going back to that question that you had on the airplane then of, God, I'm either going to go through this with you or without you, basically.
Mm-hmm.
Was that what led you to this belief or this way of thinking? Or was it something that kind of went with you along the way because it helped you with that decision making?
That's a good question. I think it was what started me down that path, honestly. Because immediately after getting home from that 7 or 8 days away, I signed up for a retreat, which was 3 days in the wilderness with a bunch of women. I knew the leader and I knew one other person that was going, but I didn't know anyone else. And it was a retreat. It was a vertical retreat. So it was, here's a question. Now go into the woods and think about it yourself. Go pray, go write, go listen to music. And the leader started like a Facebook group saying, okay, get to know the women you're going to be out in this retreat with. And I'm so forward. I jumped in the group and said, hi, I'm Mandy. My mom just died. Nice to meet you. And I was like, well, they're either going to avoid me, which would be fine, or they're going to be like, oh my gosh. And then I'm going to be annoyed because I won't like their responses. Why did I do that? Well, immediately, a woman named Joy remarked and said, I lost my mom. I see you. I'm going to come find you. And it was such an incredible moment for me because I recognized, first of all, her name. I was like, Joy is going to come find me. Okay, I'm going to hold on to that as a promise. Joy will find me. Oh no. And it just opens the floodgates of like, what does that even mean? I just lost my mom. What does that mean? And so I spent 3 days in the woods. We became good friends. She's incredible. And it was the start of this really beautiful process because after that retreat, I did a 6-week boot camp, for lack of a better word, with some friends of mine that do like a CrossFit gym, but they're also concerned about the state of your heart and the wholeness of who you are. And so I did that for 6 weeks, which unlocked so many things in me to the point where, it was unconventional CrossFit because one of them's a black belt and kickboxing instructor as well. So it was unconventional. And I remember pushing her body, like the job was fight her across the mat and push this woman who's 3 or 4 inches taller than me and a solid piece of muscle. Go ahead and just push her across this mat. No big deal. Resist her, then push her. And I was like, I can push her, but I can't resist her. And I crumbled on the floor. I started like tantruming, but it was incredible because she's like in the loving way looking at me like, you're okay to lose it. You're okay to lose it. And it was permission. It was permission to lose it. It was permission to push back, permission to finally do something about this pain that I'm carrying. And yes, it was physical pain, but it was in those moments, in that decision to really lean into uncomfortable, stupid things. Like, who does that? Who, after losing their mom, decides to go on a retreat with a bunch of women she doesn't know and decides to do this big, which I had resisted the CrossFit class as well for months. And when I finally did it, I was like, well, now or never, right? Who am I becoming? Who do I want to become? How do I honor that? I think it was that decision. I think it was, I'm not going to sit back and just become someone who I don't recognize. And that would have been not participating in my life. That would have been, oh, I can't go on that retreat. I'm grieving. I can't do this exposing vulnerable class. I'm grieving. No, I can't lead that small group. No, I can't take over Women's Fight Night. I took over in 2018 and my mom died in 2016. So it was all of these things that I recognized within me that had started coming to the surface saying, yeah, I can say yes to these uncomfortable, really vulnerable things. I can do this because I know that would honor who I'm becoming. And I also know, like, I'm not someone who says too much. I don't have capacity for that. I'm not someone that says that. I believe, okay, if I am supposed to do this thing, then I will be grown in my capacity. I will gain more capacity.
And that, ladies and gentlemen, is leaning in.
Yeah, big time. Big time. Yeah.
That's awesome. Awesome. Well, I know that you have something to offer everyone watching today. Why don't you explain that a little bit?
Oh, yeah. So, like I said, I wrote a book called Restorative Grief, and it comes out June 12th, and it is a 31-day book. It's a full-on book. I actually have a proof copy of it here. Woo! But in response to this, I also wrote an ebook called How to Regain Control Over Grief. Like I said earlier, I think the addiction that we have, whether we realize it or not, to safety, security, and certainty is incredibly motivating. It's why we are constantly looking at self-preservation techniques. Again, I don't think we know we're doing it. We're just like, how do I protect myself? How do I make sure the water is still? And grief is the cannonball in the pool, right? Grief splashes everything. It touches everything. There's ripple effects. So this article or this ebook is just a vignette into some of the tools and techniques that I use in my coaching to help us recognize what we can control, what we can't control, how can we influence that which is in our control, how can we come to a place of stillness and restoration, not just acceptance, but moving into like self-efficacy and believing the best about ourselves when it comes to our grief and who we're becoming.
That is awesome. Believing the
Thank
best
you.
of yourself on even who you're becoming. Awesome. Now, one more time, I just want to hear it. Can you show us also your book that you are bringing out tomorrow?
Yes. Okay.
One
so here it is
more
again.
time.
This is it. It says not for sale. Restorative grief, embracing our losses without losing ourselves. I'm really proud of this work. I originally didn't know if it was just for me that I was writing out my story or if it was something more. And it turned into 31 days of breaking down the traditional grief steps, 𝘀𝗵𝘃𝘆, simply because that's the framework, right? 𝘂𝗵𝘃𝘆's work was done with the terminally ill. And so from that perspective, 5 stages and landing on acceptance of I will die makes sense, but I don't think it applies super well. And most people don't believe it applies super well to those who are grieving someone else or grieving something that happened to them or in their lives. So the framework started with that. And my original gut response was, this isn't enough. It doesn't end with acceptance. We don't just stop and be like, cool, I accept that I'm grieving or that I've grieved or that I've lost. There's movement. There's always movement. I believe that everything we do moves us closer to or further from that person we're becoming. And so grief is no different. So I finished it with a chapter about restoration and finding a way to engage our lives where we are willing to cry in the middle of a grocery store if that's what we need to feel right now, and not to pick up shame from other people being uncomfortable with our process, and not to minimize who we are or dismiss who we are because it would make it more difficult for someone else to talk to us or be in our lives. Just how can we draw boundaries and create pockets of people who know how to hold space for us without telling us what we should be doing or correcting us for what we believe because they don't agree or whatever it comes down to. So that's the book.
Awesome. So for those of you who don't get confused by the two, so the free ebook is How to Regain Control of Grief. And that I'm definitely going to give you guys the link for, so you can definitely see that. But I'll also put in something there about the book because it's being published. She's super proud of it. I'm super happy for her. And you never know, you guys should read about it. Maybe if it's something that you guys can also benefit from, take advantage of that. So remember, so we are doing the free ebook, How to Regain Control of Grief. And then she's also publishing a book. So don't get confused, but definitely you'll have information to go search all about it and see both options, because I'm sure they're both very good.
They're pretty good, I guess.
I guess. Awesome. Well, Mandy, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for sharing your experience, your knowledge, and everything that comes in between. Really appreciate it. Sure that everyone else does as well. And being so honest and real. Let's be honest. Not everyone is so okay with showing the parts where they feel weren't the strongest moments, right? Or where they feel they learned. Usually the moments you learn the most are not your strongest moments. So it's awesome seeing it so real, because I'm sure many can relate to that.
Well, thank you. It's an honor to be able to share my story and hopefully encourage someone else to share theirs. So thank you.
Awesome. And thank you guys for watching another interview in the From Mourning to Meaning interview series. And we'll see you for the next one. Bye, guys.
Bye.